Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series in which I pick on historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and in some cases the downright notorious, and try to situate them in their historical context, but also look at how they are represented in a particular game system and to try and assess just how fairly the game system treats them. So today I'm going to be looking at two antagonists from the Spanish-American War of 1898. Over here we have the armoured cruiser USS Brooklyn, and over here we have the Spanish cruiser Cristobal Colon. Now both these ships represented the pinnacle of armoured cruiser technology within their respective navies at the time this war broke out. And very helpfully for my purposes today, they were also direct or nearly direct antagonists in the fateful Battle of Santiago, which was fought on the 3rd of July 1898. It was the decisive naval battle of the Spanish-American War, certainly as far as the Caribbean was concerned, but it was really the battle that broke Spain's naval power and effectively decided the conflict in the Caribbean. So, without any further ado, just to say that the game system I am picking on today is once more going to be the excellent Dreadnoughts, Fortresses of Steel. Yes, I have hit a milestone in this series in the important sense that for the first time, I am returning to a game system that I have already covered. And the reason I'm doing this is because having had the delightful privilege of being involved in the playtesting of this game for a few months now, I've been enjoying it tremendously. And so I really wanted an excuse to come back to it and look at how it treats two other ships. My previous video, of course, dealt with the Japanese and Russian battleships Mikasa and Knyaz Suvorov, respectively. So now it's time to dial it back to a conflict which I find very interesting, the Spanish-American War. So, although I have covered this game system previously, for the benefit of those of you who have not seen my other videos, I'll just talk you very quickly through the anatomy of the ship's cards. So essentially you have your nice graphic of the warship concerned, and you have these boxes. These are used for tracking damage, and the information contained on them is obviously the location they represent, and how well armoured it is. That's the bit that's of primary interest for the assessment today. The box over here on the right is their speed rating. And down here, we of course have the armament. And very handily, it lists the historical armament of the ship while also giving its game effects. So it makes for a very easy comparison. These boxes here are how much by way of fire the ship can endure before it's engulfed in flames and effectively a total wreck. And this bit down here is its size category with a modifier for how easy it is to hit based upon its size. And that is it. They're quite simple, they're quite straightforward, and as I say, the way it's laid out makes for a very, very easy comparison. So before I start, just a little bit of history and to introduce the two ships that we're going to be comparing today. And hopefully it doesn't give away too much by way of spoilers, but I'm going to start with the tragically short-lived Cristobal Colon, of which we have a lovely picture here. When I say she was short-lived, I really am not kidding. This photograph was taken very shortly after the ship was delivered to the Spanish at the Italian port of Genoa. And so that instantly leads me into a good place to start about the origins of this ship, because when the Spanish-American War breaks out, Spain has a fairly decent group of about half a dozen cruisers, which are modern, reasonably well armed, reasonably well protected. But of the main overseas force of her armoured cruisers, the one that should, in theory, steal the show is this one, the Cristobal Colon. But she is not a homegrown Spanish design at all. This ship was part of the very successful Italian-designed Garibaldi class, and they were very fine armoured cruisers for their day. They were very well protected. They were designed to be able to go toe-to-toe with contemporary battleships if necessary, but also had the speed to be able to break off an engagement if an opponent was proving too powerful. And in an age when armoured cruisers were almost habitually larger than battleships because of their machinery requirements, these ships, rather economically, were actually quite small. In fact, the Garibaldi class was smaller than most contemporary British pre-dreadnoughts, so decently sized ship makes it slightly less expensive, but everything you want in an armoured cruiser, and basically, I mean, they have future battle cruiser written all over them. But they were a marvellous design and very popular, and in some ways it's a great compliment, I'll say, to the Italians, that of the vessels that they built, the first 5 were purchased by foreign navies before any entered Italian service. The Argentinians snapped up the first 4. Spain bought the 5th, which was to have been named Garibaldi. In fact, I think she was the second try at naming one of these vessels Garibaldi before someone else bought one. And then finally, on the 6th attempt, the Italians finally got to keep one of these for themselves. So they were a very highly regarded class of ship. And you can see it. I mean, looking at this, they present a very handsome, if slightly unusual profile. You can see there's the curious arrangement of the single mainmast in the center, where most navies preferred to have 2 masts for various reasons, one fore, one aft. So these ships are instantly recognizable with their twin funnels, their 2 funnels, fore and aft of the mast, and they're a very distinctive profile. Now, clearly this has been taken on laundry day, so I'm afraid much of the upper deck and parts of the shelter deck have been obscured by the mats and the hammocks, which have been set out to dry. But one thing that these conceal, ordinarily I would moan about the inability to see the main armament, but there's something very important that was missing about the Cristobal Colon, and it's that she did not have her main guns when she was delivered. That obviously has a very important effect on her ability to participate in the war that she was about to be plunged into. And in a way, it makes this unfortunate ship an emblematic, I'll say, of the situation the Spanish Navy found itself in at the start of the Spanish-American War. The Navy had been cash-strapped for a long time. The Spanish Empire was in serious financial trouble. On paper, it looked like a formidable global power, but anyone who knew their foreign affairs would know that the Spanish Empire had been on the ropes for many years. And by the 1890s, that empire, the source of its great wealth, was actively crumbling. And so the Spanish had nowhere near the amount of money they needed. And it says everything about their situation, that even with the urgency of the situation, neither the time nor the money was there to give this ship the weaponry that it needed. But aside from that, despite the fact that you have all these deficiencies and some elements of mismanagement, she also represents the fact that the Spanish Navy had a good idea of what it wanted and the type of ship that it could reasonably afford and that could meet its imperial commitments as they stood, until, of course, a major rising power decides to take you on. There's not so much you can do about that. So I won't go into the details yet because they'll come important later, but only to say that in terms of her active service, this ship lasted barely more than a year, and she did meet her end during the Spanish-American War. But what about the representative of the rising power that had decided to challenge Spain? So here we have a very handsome image of a very handsome ship, admittedly. USS Brooklyn is quite eye-catching. The first thing that strikes you about her is that she appears very formidably armed. There's these big turrets, which, you'd normally associate with a second-class battleship. But to all intents and purposes, they look formidable. The other thing that struck me on first seeing her is how incredibly French she looks. It's not so obvious from this photograph, although you can tell by the way that turret base is projecting from her hull. She has that very curvy tumble home that's characteristic of French designs. And that's very interesting because, like the Cristobal colonne, she shows the influence of foreign design upon the US Navy. You know, people aren't just sticking to their own designs; they're experimenting with other people's. And what makes that even more interesting is that the ship was not built in France. She was actually constructed by Cramp's shipyard right in the USA, was designed by the US, but that French influence is very, very clearly there. They are trying this stuff out because they want to see how well it performs. And that actually leads to some very interesting comparisons because effectively, when looking at how these two armoured cruisers performed in battle against each other, you are actually comparing French and Italian design influences as well as Spanish and American. So we have this very handsome ship. She's obviously built for speed, as all French-influenced ships were, and indeed the function of the armoured cruiser is to be a fast vessel. She packs the punch, and outwardly she presents a very impressive picture. The $64,000 question, of course, is how well would she perform as a combat vessel? And that's what I'm going to go on to explore now. So when the Spanish-American War begins, these two ships are remarkably young. The Brooklyn is launched in 1896 and enters service in 1897. The Colon is launched in 1896 and is completed in 1897 as well. Apologies, I've just realised I was out a year. Brooklyn is in fact launched in 1895 and commissions in 1896. It's Colon that launches in 1896 and completes in 1897. Now, harking back to what I just said about her lack of a primary armament, completed is probably a bit of a strong term to apply to this one, but I'll stick with it for now. And looking at the comparison of the two ships, I think a very good place to start would be their armour protection, because if we work down from the top of the ship card and go through the various bits and pieces. Now, a word about armour before I plunge in. These ships are actually quite hard to quantify because, rather strangely, given that the US Navy ships are quite well documented, there is some variance in the sources about just how thick the Brooklyn's armour was. And there's even more confusion in some sources about just how thick the Cristobal Colon's armour was. So it's very difficult to resolve these questions. The Colon in particular is a tricky customer because the Garibaldi class were not static. It was not a design that the Italians just cranked out endlessly and then they were all identical. It's not accurate to say that. The Garibaldi class were more of a broadly similar set of ships built to the same specifications, but they all varied to different degrees in their armament, the density of their protection, the final batch which entered the Italian service, and even the two which ended up being bought by Japan, entering their service as Kasuga and Nishin, all had subtle differences. And these, of course, you know, they make it very difficult to pin down quite what the Colon had. Now, luckily, although the figures quoted in Jane's Fighting Ships, which is one of my favourite sources for this period, they are somewhat off. I think Jane errs on the side of giving them thicker armour than they historically had. The proportions relative to each other are broadly correct. So I'm going to stick with those. And I'm going to call in my friend Jane because he is so useful in these things. So here is the armor layout for a for the Giuseppe Garibaldi. This is the later one, the one that actually entered Italian service at the end of the 1890s. But it gives you a good sense of the armor distribution, and you can probably see the figures that are quoted. An awful lot of it is 6-inch armor. I think there was a fair bit of rounding up there. And similarly for the Brooklyn, we have the same kind of detailed diagram of the armor layout, which we know will be accurate because there was only one of these ever built. So all the information you see here definitely pertains to that ship. And again, you can see from the figures that there's a fair bit of 8-inch referenced, but it varies quite dramatically. And I'll go into the reasons for why that was in a short while when I talk more about the armor. As ever, just for the benefit of those of you who haven't watched any of this series before, you have to be a little bit careful with Janes, and particularly when I talk about this area. So these represent the ship's flotation level, but they are not an accurate depiction of its watertight subdivision. It's more an abstract system that Jane devised to basically help him classify how long different ships could keep afloat in terms of his war game rules. That's what these were generated for. It was all originally for Jane's naval war games as much as it was for ship recognition and ship data. So just bear in mind those little health warnings, and also the fact that, like any historical source, although he was very thorough, Fred Jane was only as good as the information he was given. So let's sort of work our way round. The conning towers, the armoured command centres, if you will, of both ships, I've given an armour rating of 4 in this game. It's equivalent armour. And I think that's fair because it ties in with what's given in Jane's, and if you allow for the variation in other sources, there's only about an inch or two's difference. So I think that's right. The same applies to this rating, which is the main turrets, and that applies to all of the ship's heavy guns. The armor and protection rating given here is 4 for both ships, and again, they have very similar protection to their turrets. Interestingly enough, Cristobal Colon has been given an extra rating of a 5 in brackets, and that relates to the strength of her barbettes and the protection over her magazine spaces. So she does enjoy better protection to her vitals in that sense. Moving on, you look at TS, which is the secondary armament, and this is where the ships begin to diverge quite dramatically. The secondary battery on the Cristobal Colon is rated a 4, while that of the Brooklyn is rated 1, and that is a major difference. Similarly, if I can draw our attention to the hull-mounted torpedo tubes, the picture gets even more skewed in the favour of the Spanish ship. The armour rating around her torpedo tubes is 5, whereas the Brooklyn has a 0. Lastly, let's just take a look at their flotation hits. Now, they've got 3 boxes each, and armor rating on the Spanish vessel is 554. So the armor gradually degrades as damage is taking the reduced effectiveness of the protection as it's perforated. The equivalent figures for the US ship are 5, 4, and 3. So this gives the impression that in some important respects the Brooklyn is weaker. But surely you might ask, if you'd had a close look at the figures in Jane's, of the 2, patches of the Brooklyn have the thickest armour. So what's going on here? Well, the answer lies in the distribution of that armour. So let's look again at the Italian design ship. We have a very solid citadel arrangement where the side armour is built up into a fairly hefty box. And this extends all the way up to the barbette. So the turret trunking and the magazine handling spaces and the hoists are protected behind a very well designed box. The secondary armament is similarly well protected behind the ship's citadel. Now, don't go by the arrangement shown here because the colonne had a very different secondary battery arrangement. In fact, if I bring her picture back, you can see that unlike the later Italian ships illustrated in Jane's, her main secondary armament was all at main deck level, and it was all protected behind this nice load of armor here. It's a bit thinner than the armor further down, but in a way that's less important because the casemates have a decent level of protection, and equally importantly, their ammunition handling systems are very well protected. So you've got a nice solid box built around the vitals of the ship. Let's compare this to the Brooklyn, and the differences between the two are quite dramatic. In keeping with French ideas, the Brooklyn does have fairly solid protection down by the waterline, but it's a very, very thin strip against a backdrop of a hull that is effectively completely unarmored. So there's the contrast between the two. Garibaldi's armor is Cristobal Colon's armor is very often slightly thinner than Brooklyn's, but its better coverage is what gives her protection ratings. The Brooklyn, by contrast, has some very densely armoured areas, but they're so small. It's just these isolated positions. And even though the ammunition tubes to all of her 8-inch turrets are quite well protected, there's some terrible vulnerabilities all around them. So therein lies the problem for USS Brooklyn if she starts to take hits. Behind that very impressive looking hull, there's actually not a great deal of decent plating to keep her safe. And the same goes for her torpedo tubes as much as the guns. So whereas the Cristobal Colon's torpedo tubes were behind the side armour, they were very well protected in armoured casemates built into that armoured box. By contrast, the Brooklyn's torpedo tubes, you can actually see them on the illustration here, if I can pick the card up. Come here. The Brooklyn's tubes are actually outside the area covered by the ship's quite thin armoured belt. So in some respects, although her armour is good and the places that enjoy it are well protected, taken overall, the Brooklyn has some serious deficiencies in protection. Now, what about flotation and flooding resistance? They've each been given 3 flotation boxes. Now, that's an interesting choice because in some respects, the Brooklyn was slightly better off than the Colonne in this regard, and that's partly down to her being a larger ship and enjoying better cellular subdivision. So she had no armoured bulkheads in the same way that the Colonne had, but she did have more compartmentalization, which gave her a little bit of an edge. In fact, it's interesting to note that Jane's credits the Brooklyn with 16, a rating of 16 for watertight integrity and the ability to resist flooding, whereas the Garibaldi type armoured cruisers are only given a 14. However, when you come back to the issue of armor protection, I think that helps it to balance out. And also in game terms, because this is quite a generalized rating, the two are probably close enough to warrant the same number of boxes. So much for the armor. What about the speed rating? They've both been given a speed rating of 6, which, if you translate the game system into real speed, amounts to about 18 knots, give or take. That is actually a very reasonable speed assessment for these two ships, especially if you assume that they've been steaming for a while and have got dirty and fouled hulls. On trials, they both made a very good speed. They were able to maintain 20 knots for quite a long time. The Brooklyn actually exceeded that on her trials, but she was run very, very light, and she never, throughout her long career afterwards, managed to attain a speed of 21 knots again. As new at the time of the Spanish-American War, both ships could probably make and hold 20 knots quite easily. However, if you pushed beyond a certain level, you'd begin to wear your machinery out, and of course you'd inevitably need the dockyard time to keep the ship's bottom clean and prevent marine growth from reducing your speed. Brooklyn did benefit more than the Cristobal Colon did in that regard. But even so, it's difficult to compare how efficient the two ships were because Cristobal Colon did log a slightly slower speed in her final battle, but that was because she hadn't had the necessary maintenance. The bottom of her hull was a bit of a state after a lot of hard steaming. And at a crucial moment during her final battle, she also began to run short of high-grade coal and had to switch to a slightly poorer substitute, which had a negative impact. Now, you could say that hands the advantage to the Brooklyn, but of course, because on the day the US were caught somewhat by surprise, Brooklyn, in fact, wasn't running at her full power and had to make do with a fairly respectable speed of between 16 to 18 knots, but she wasn't at her best on that day. So, all things considered, I think giving them the equivalent speed rating is fair. What about their armament? Now, very handily, it's easy to discuss because the armament is listed. So the Brooklyn was equipped with eight 8-inch guns, which was a very respectable armament for an armoured cruiser, and they were disposed in what for the time was a very efficient arrangement. It's not so easy to see on the ship card, so I'm going to bring the Jane's illustration back. You can see the forward and aft turrets and the two wing turrets. Again, a very French idea, this lozenge arrangement. And that is considered a very good one at the time because in theory it gives the ship excellent all-round fire. And she's never short of a gun barrel, whichever direction she shoots in. Now, in reality, if you fired those on too much of a forward bearing, you would damage your superstructure, especially given the fact that it was completely unarmored. You know, you would damage it. But theoretically, it was possible. In addition to those 8-inch guns with their very commanding field of fire, this is the advantage of a ship that's very high out the water, as Brooklyn was. You know, the French went for the height as well as the tumble home. These guns have very good command, and it's easy to work them in all weathers. Now, the mountings have been given a -1 modifier, but that's more to do with the arrangement of the turrets and the training mechanism rather than the other elements, because as I say, they're very well placed in this design and can be fought in all weathers. So the secondary armament consisted of 12 of the US Navy's excellent 5-inch 40 caliber gun. These were disposed around the hull at main deck level. They had a reasonable command. They weren't too bad at all. And lastly, 5 18-inch torpedo tubes, 1 in the bow and 2 on each broadside. By comparison, the Colon is very weakly armed, and the main reason for it is the fact that she is missing her 2 10-inch guns. Now, I like the fact that in the game, the ship card, it comes with the main armament grayed out, but you can, if you wish, play optional rules, and you can see it well enough to include the main armament. So, had the Cristobal Colon carried her 2 10-inch 40 caliber guns as she was designed to do, she would have had weapons which, while outnumbered by the number of tubes available to the Brooklyn, would have packed a heavier punch. And against a badly armoured target like the Brooklyn, they could have actually been quite effective. As it was, the modern 6-inch and 4.7-inch guns that equipped the Colon were very, very respectable weapons indeed for the day. And you can see the game actually credits the Colon's secondary armament with greater penetrative power at all ranges than the Brooklyn's secondaries. And I think that's a very fair rating for the two ships relative to each other. And then, of course, you have her 4 torpedo tubes, 2 per side, which discharged torpedoes that were very slightly smaller than their American counterparts, but not really any distance behind them in terms of their destructive capability. And the very last thing I want to look at is the size rating. So I'd mentioned at the beginning that the Garibaldi type cruisers were very compact for armoured cruisers, and this is reflected in their size profile. The Cristobal Colon is a medium, so there's no alteration, positive or negative, to an enemy ship's ability to target her. The Brooklyn, by virtue of the fact that she has a very seaworthy hull that gives her guns a good field of fire, pays for it by just about falling into the large category, which gives a vessel attempting to target her a +1 bonus. Now, as so often with any game system, the boundary line between size categories has to be a little bit arbitrary sometimes, but it wouldn't be fair to say that these ships were close in size. They were noticeably different. And just to put that into context, the Brooklyn was over 402 feet in length overall, whereas the Cristobal Colon was only 366 and a smidge. And the same difference is true in their beam, although it's a bit less pronounced. So the Cristobal Colon's 59 foot, 10.5 inches. Call it a 60-foot beam if you're rounding up. Whereas the Brooklyn's beam is heading towards 65 feet. So there is a difference, but the main one is in their length and in how high the hull sits above water. So you've got them at just either side of that boundary line. But again, I think it's a fair division, and you have to draw these boundaries somewhere. So I suppose, having covered all these different statistics and assessed them against each other, the big question is how true to life are they? Well, in the final battle of the Cristobal Colon, which also, as it turned out, was USS Brooklyn's only time firing her guns in anger, for the most part, the engagement was a very one-sided experience for the poor Spaniards. They did succeed in catching the blockading US squadron by surprise, and they made their attempt to escape from Santiago before the port fell. But unfortunately, despite the initial surprise, the US fleet recovered itself and began to pursue. And really, Admiral Cervera's force, the main strength of his force was the Cristobal Colon and the 3 armoured cruisers of the Infanta Maria Teresa type that accompanied her. The US force comprised a mix of battleships, armoured cruisers like the Brooklyn and the New York, and a few patrol boats. But the overall collection of firepower greatly favoured the US Navy. And what the battle ended up being was very much a stern chase. The Cristobal Colon lasted a lot longer than her companions, and that's not unexpected. Out of all the Spanish ships present that day, she was the most heavily armoured. And she is believed to have taken a total of 8 hits over the course of the battle. As far as we know, the Brooklyn took no damaging hits, which was probably quite lucky. In fact, it's said in many of the sources she took no hits at all. It meant that the inadequacies of her protection scheme were never seriously put to the test. Probably a good thing. Whereas the Colon managed to absorb most of the hits, which were a mixture of 8-inch and 13-inch shells. And she wasn't actually that seriously damaged when her captain decided to beach her. It was more a decision based around the fact that she was beginning to lag. I'd mentioned the switch over from high-grade coal to inferior coal, which played a big part in slowing her down. And the decision to beach and then scuttle her was motivated very much by a desire to save the crew from what would have probably been a pointless death. In terms of how much of a fight the two ships put up, the Colon performed very creditably, I think. For most of the chase, she could only bring one, at best two, of her 6-inch guns to bear on the pursuing US ships. And she did manage to hit the modern US battleship, the Iowa, twice. One hit damaged the ship's dispensary, didn't affect her combat power any. The second ship hit her in the waterline and actually managed to slow her down a little bit, but not enough to make her break off or otherwise, cease fire. But it was very impressive given that the Cristobal Colon was fighting with one hand effectively tied firmly behind her back. The Brooklyn was keeping up a hot fire on the Cristobal Colon during the latter period of the engagement, but she was fighting from a bit of a distance, and it's difficult to gauge how accurate her fire was. In fact, accuracy was not great for either side in this battle, and at best, you're looking at about a 5% hit rate out of all the shells each ship fired. So it was not the finest hour for either navy, but it did end up being a decisive victory for the United States. And so that brings me to the end of this particular analysis. I think overall, my sense is that the game has treated both of these ships very rarely. Rarely? What am I talking about? Treated both of these ships very fairly. I think it's modeled their capabilities quite accurately. And if you want to pit them against each other in this game system head to head without any other vessels present to see how they would have performed against each other, that's a very interesting exercise. No surprise there. Having played this game quite a few times, I think the designers, Rolf Grein and Nick Salmon, have done an absolutely fantastic job. And I am tempted in the future to actually return to this game system and try comparing other ships. But I will leave these two brave combatants for now. We know what happened to the Cristobal Colon. She met her end off the southern coast of Cuba. In case you're wondering what became of USS Brooklyn, she went on to live a very long and fairly happy, but also relatively quiet life in the wake of the tumultuous events of 1898. So from about 1908 onwards, after a decent amount of active service, the ship's effectively put into reserve and given some refits, mainly improvements to her fire control and her gunnery systems. The loading mechanisms are overhauled and so forth. And she's also given a few of the other spruce-ups that the US armoured cruisers are all treated to from about 1908 onwards. But she's not reactivated in a big way until about 1914. And she serves very much in a second-line capacity during the First World War. And in her final days, she's out in the Pacific as flagship of the Pacific Fleet's destroyers in about 1920, before being put up for sale for scrap in 1921. So a big contrast in the careers of these two ships, both of which were stunningly beautiful. It's a great shame that one was destroyed, but I'm very glad the Brooklyn had a long and happy life. But I will leave the story of these two ships here, and it only remains for me to thank you very much for following this series. As always, a huge hello, massive greetings to my veterans who put up with me and follow the various series I put on the channel no matter what. Thank you guys so much for your company. It always is a real pleasure. And as always, I look forward to the comments and I will respond to them as soon as I can. Any feedback is always welcome. And it's just great to have you along for the ride. If you're new to the channel, a very warm welcome to you. If it's an interest in these two ships that have brought you here, then I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. If you're interested in similar comparisons, please do have a look at some of the other titles I've done in the Ships of War series. And if you're here for wargaming in general, whether it's naval or terrestrial or aircraft based, then please do have a wander around the channel. I hope you'll find some other stuff that you like, but you're very welcome in any case. I'll just say a huge thank you to all of you, wherever you're tuning in from, or whoever you are, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you so much for your support and for your interest. It really means a lot. And I bid you all a very fond farewell, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks again, and do take care. Bye.